Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. As you know, we do these each week, released on Tuesdays in conjunction with usually newly published books that are released that day. This week's book is The Assault on American Excellence by Anthony Kronman. He is, as it says right there on the cover, the former dean of the Yale Law School. He served as the dean of the Yale Law School from 1994 to 2004 and has taught at the university for 40 years. He is the author or co-author of 5 books, including Education's End, Why Our Colleges and Universities Have Given Up on the Meaning of Life, and Confessions of a Born-Again Pagan, which I really liked, but we get into that in the conversation. I ask him what he means by a pagan. Turns out he's actually pretty religious in the Jordan Peterson kind of way. That is the search for and discovery of universal truths in myths and stories, in literature, and so forth. We also get into, the core of his book is on the current crisis on college campuses involving free speech, hate speech, political correctness, microaggressions, safe spaces, trigger warnings, the hypersensitivity of students to speakers like Milo Yiannopoulos. And we get into who he would invite. What does it mean to have viewpoint diversity? He believes in that, and yet recognizes the role of racial and gender and other categories of diversity that colleges have striven for over the decades. So we kind of try to nuance what's the right amount of that to have, given our controversial history in the United States on those issues. Then we talk about what it means to be excellent. What is excellence? What's the role of a college and a university? And then we finally touch on memory, that is the pulling down of statues, the renaming of colleges, that sort of thing, which Yale was embroiled in over Calhoun College. John C. Calhoun was a slave trader and slave owner. Yale himself, L.E.U. Yale, was a slave trader but not owner. Anyway, and then the difference between that and, say, a public park that has a Confederate statue put up in the 1910s or 20s in the Jim Crow era as a celebration of white supremacy and what the South stood for in that regard, and why that's different from renaming colleges on campus, and yet those are different still from let's say, pulling down statues of Hitler and Stalin. Anyway, so we get into all that and talk about some of these timeless and deep issues. And as always, if you appreciate the podcast and enjoy it, you can support it at skeptic.com/donate, or you can do it through Patreon. And this is how we support it. There's no ads or commercials here, and it's all part of our general education program of the Skeptic Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. Thank you for your support. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast. The new book is The Assault on American Excellence. And I first came across this and your work in that op-ed you did for the Wall Street Journal that was in that Saturday review section, which is one of my favorites to read every week because they do excerpts. And this is one way I find out about nonfiction books. My specialty, my beat here is nonfiction books that are new, mostly science books. So I have to say I really enjoyed reading your book. It's not a science book, and most of the science books I read are not that literary. A few are, like by Richard Dawkins and Steve Pinker. They're very stylistic in their writing, but most are kind of cut and dried, meat and potatoes, kind of just the facts, ma'am. Your writing is very heavily influenced by your humanist, I think, training and tradition in not just the law, but in all of history and so on. I really appreciated that. And also, and I had to do a quick read because I didn't get this till Saturday. So in my opening lecture in my first year students at Chapman University, we can't use that phrase freshman anymore either, as you mentioned in your book. I teach them how to read a book. Which is, of course, they know how to read, but how to read a book strategically. You don't just turn to the first page and start reading. You start with the cover, and I always appreciate nice covers. Your cover is, very striking. The red with the shattered kind of Greek pillar there of representing excellence and so forth. And there's no subtitle. Yours one of the few books I've come across in many years without a subtitle. So my rule is all books should either have a descriptive title or subtitle, one way or the other. You've done it in one, so congratulations on that. And then I always say, so you start with the title or subtitle, and who is this person? Well, it says right there on the cover, the dean of Yale Law School. Okay, no fooling around here. We got the head guy. And then, of course, you read about the bio. Who is this person? So you know where the person's coming from. And then you look at the table of contents, excellence, speech, diversity, and memory. 4 chapters. That's it. Okay, so you've really broken it down into 4 categories, which we'll do when we go through this book. And then I always do kind of the first and last paragraph of each of the chapters, and I skim through and look for any graphs or charts or pull quotes or indented quotes that stand out, just to kind of get an idea of where you're going, and then you start reading. So that's kind of my quick and dirty guide to how to read a book.
You've missed one critical step, though. If you're an author yourself, after you look at the cover and read a little bit about the author of the book, you look at the footnotes and the index to
see if I was in there. Yeah, unfortunately I'm not. You missed my the Moral Arc, my one book I wrote that kind of touches on this stuff. Although actually I wrote the Moral Arc I finished researching the Moral Arc right when the problem started. So I missed that. The problem being that you're addressing, that also Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff address in their recent book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Right. Heather McDonald is addressed and others. And it really appeared to have started maybe 2013, 2014, when there was this shift in students' attitudes about free speech, diversity, or free speech, political correctness, that sort of thing. So I thought we might start with what I did when I had Jonathan on the podcast. Is there really a problem? And if there is, what is the problem? And by way of background, I mean, like I teach at Chapman University. If you walk around campus, it's bucolic and peaceful and nice, and kids are just holed up in their dorms reading, or if they're at the Starbucks or whatever. I've been on Yale campus a couple times. You don't see protests. You don't see, big disruptions. And mostly college seems like it was when I was in college. Yet, if you accumulate enough of these incidences that have happened, and all you have to do is watch Fox News, and Tucker Carlson has his weekly campus craziness segment. It seems like to an outsider who would walk on campus, like it's insane. Students have completely lost their minds. Yet, if you walk on campus, you don't see any of this. So the question is, what really is the problem that you're addressing in your book that we should all be concerned about?
Yeah, well, there are from time to time visible, notable, disruptive moments, episodes. A speaker is shouted off the stage, students march around and declaim or proclaim this or that. But for the most part, campus life is as you describe it. Things go on as they have from day to day in their quiet or ordinary way. What is really different today from a decade ago is a change in the culture, in the atmospherics of academic life, which I feel in faculty meetings when we're discussing prospective appointments to the faculty, in the classroom when I'm studying a text with my students, in casual conversations around the campus with students and faculty. There is a settling fog of I would describe it as of discouragement, of suppression of ideas and of speech, which doesn't manifest itself often, certainly not regularly, in the sorts of explosive events that were so dramatically prominent on our campuses in the 1960s. It's quieter, it's more pervasive, but I think in many ways it's more damaging because it strikes at the very heart of the academic enterprise of inquiry, truth-seeking, free expression, testing ideas, measuring the strength of your own ideas in the back and forth with faculty and students. And that enterprise has been compromised. It has been it sits in a shadow now of censorship and self-censorship, which I think is very damaging to the culture of academic life. That's the problem.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to do in the book, of course, a lot has been written about the free speech issues on campus and the debates about renaming memorials. We had a big debate of that kind here at Yale a few years back. And then finally about diversity and inclusion. What does this mean? What does it require? What are its effects on the culture? A lot of discussion of these incidents separately, and a lot of complaints about them, and especially on the conservative side of the political spectrum. There have been lots of commentators and pundits who have wagged a finger of disapproval and said, this is ridiculous, it's shameful, and so on and so forth. I wanted in my book to dig a little deeper and see if I could identify a common root from which these various phenomena all spring, which they all exhibit or manifest in one way or another. And what I propose in the book is very briefly this, and I'll just state it, and then we can continue with the conversation. Our colleges and universities should do the very best job they can of making sure they admit the most talented and qualified applicants, regardless of their background. And if some kids are coming from backgrounds of disadvantage, maybe they should be given a leg up in the process, an extra look at a minimum, maybe even a preference of some kind or other. I'm all for fairness in admissions and even redressing the historical balance where it has worked in a particular direction against the members of certain groups. I'm all for that. That is, you might say, a pro-equality, a pro-democracy idea, fairness of opportunity in the admissions process. But once the kids come through the turnstile and they are on campus, once they are actually engaged in the process of studying and learning and debating, they are members of a community which is not itself, by its very nature, egalitarian at its heart. It's a community which is devoted to the cultivation and transmission of excellence in a whole host of different disciplines, and to the pursuit of the truth, which is not a democratic value. We don't decide what's true in any field by a show of hands or a vote. So yes, fairness in admissions, a process open to talent, to kids from every corner and walk of life, all races, ethnicities, backgrounds, and maybe, as I say, a special boost for kids coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. But once they're on campus, sitting in the classroom, debating with their professors, they should be introduced to the culture of excellence and truth-seeking, which the school itself represents and embodies.
Yeah, so you're distinguishing the selection process for who gets into Yale or Harvard or whatever, and then after that, then let the meritocracy begin.
Yes.
So,
yes.
But of course, Jonathan Haidt had that lecture he gave that it was kind of a useful heuristic of the telos of a university. Are you after truth or are you after justice? And you have to pick one. Well, but social justice activists, they would argue that they're not two different things. That if the truth is we want equal opportunity for everybody. Some people just, grew up in impoverished homes, single mom homes, poor neighborhoods. They went to crappy public schools. They're not going to do good on their SATs. They got up Saturday morning and the mom said, "You're taking your SAT. What's an SAT?"
Sure.
Versus the Harvard kid that goes to a private school and he takes all the training courses. He's going to do 300-400 points better just by that alone. So I think that's what, many of the social justice activists, the system is not fair already from the get-go. And that the point of affirmative action in general, and then more point at colleges, is this diversity of economic situations and race is a proxy for that, let's say in the United States.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I understand all of that, and I'm sympathetic to it up to a point. But those considerations bear on the admissions process. The sorts of factors that you've just described ought to be taken into account up to a point in deciding who gets into the selective college or university that we're imagining now.
Yes.
They apply, so to speak, at the entrance point. And I would go even a little bit further than what you've just said. And if a kid from a disadvantaged background does poorly on the SAT and has low scores on the various subject matter tests, but has strong letters of recommendation from his or her teachers who say this kid has real promise, but comes from a broken home, just hasn't had the running room yet to show what he or she can do. But they've got the brains, they've got the grit, they've got the soul to do it. I'm inclined to say, let's give them a chance. And an applicant like that, in my view, gets a boost. How big a boost is an open question and not an easy one to answer, but a boost in the admissions process. And I would go a step beyond that. Once you've admitted them, if you take the risk of admitting them and say, well, they don't really on the papers look quite as solid as the other kids were admitting, but we have reason to think there's a real spark there. Maybe they need a little bit of extra help at the beginning in their freshman year to come up to speed. All of that is fine, but none of it really bears directly on my central claim, which is that the work of the college or university itself, it consists at its core not in the advancement of this or that program of social justice, but in the advancement of learning in the various fields of study and in the cultivation of those habits of mind and spirit, which in a rough and cumulative way we describe as human excellence, the excellence of being a human being, not just a talented this or that, a knowledgeable this or that, but a human being of high quality.
Right. Yeah, Heather McDonald talks about the mismatch where, say, a person qualified to be at a middling state university engineering program gets admitted into MIT engineering program because of their race or economic status or whatever, and they don't do as well because the competition is so much higher, so they fail or they partially fail or whatever, they don't succeed like they could, and that's actually harming. I don't know, I have no idea to what extent that's a serious problem or it's just an occasional issue that pops up. I don't know if you have a sense about that.
Yeah. Hard to say as an empirical matter, but Heather McDonald's point touches on one of the issues that is at the center of my discussion of the diversity question or problem in my own book. And in order to understand it, we need to take one or maybe two steps back, historically speaking, back to the point at which diversity became a fundamental axiom in the admissions process and then in the internal organization of the lives of our colleges and universities. In 1978, this is now 40 plus years ago, in a case called Bakke against the University of California, the Supreme Court held by the narrowest of margins that it was not constitutionally allowable for the University of California to explicitly use race in designing an affirmative action program that set aside a certain number of spots in the entering class that happened to be of the medical school at the University of California at Davis, setting aside a certain number of spots for Africans from identified minority groups, African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans at the time, and Native Americans. And they said, Supreme Court said, you can't use race in that way. Using race as a marker, a deliberate marker, has a very bad history. We're not going to let you use it in a positive way. But we'll tell you what. If you believe, now whoever is running the admissions program, believe that you need to admit a diverse group of students in order to have the most open and productive intellectual environment you can. And if you think that race is one element in a mix of elements that's helpful in producing that diversity, which is an educational good, well, then you can use race to that extent. And of course, every college president and dean and admissions officer understood what that meant. They said, okay, we see how the game has to be played,
right.
and shifted from race-based quotas to diversity as the fundamental norm of admissions. And that in itself wasn't bad, but one of its unintended effects was to turn diversity into an educational value in its own right, so that the students admitted under the rubric, under the flag of diversity, now came to campus as representatives of the intellectual and cultural point of view that members of their racial or ethnic group were expected to hold and to express. And the effect of that has been to tighten the connection between ethnicity and race on the one hand, and philosophical worldview, perspective, political judgment, and opinion on the other. And that is pernicious because it makes it more difficult for everyone, not just for minority students, but for all the students on the campus, to separate themselves as individuals from all of the characteristics that define them as members of this group or that group.
So those diversity characteristics are orthogonal to excellence. That is, they're independent. And so the universities are no longer selecting for excellence, they're selecting for something else that may or may not help excellence.
Yes, they are certainly orthogonal. I don't know that I would use that word, but it's not a bad one. Or orthogonal to the search for the truth.
Yeah.
You come to the table with the characteristics you possess. I come to the table with mine. Everyone sitting around the seminar table has a unique set of attributes and qualities that identify them as this or that. But we are engaged as individuals in the common pursuit of the truth of the matter, whatever it happens to be. It may be trying to figure out what Jane Austen really meant when she wrote Emma, or what Abraham Lincoln's real motives were for giving the speeches that he did in Illinois in 1857, and so on and so forth, or whether Platonism is true as a philosophical system. And in all of those conversations, your peculiar characteristics, and in particular your race and ethnicity, your gender, they may shape your view of things, but the invitation, the demand, the requirement of that inquiry is to try as best you can to see things from an independent point of view that isn't hostage to your characteristics.
Yeah, it seems to me it would matter very much which subject matter we were in, to what extent the diversity matters. If it's a chemistry class or engineering class, That's one thing. If it's say a legal course on the law and property values and redlining laws in the 1950s, it would matter if we had an African American in the seminar versus a bunch of white guys sitting around talking about redlining laws.
Yes and no. In one way, it might matter a lot and in a positive way, and in another way, perhaps it shouldn't matter at all. If an African American sitting at the table raises his or her hand and says, wait a minute, I want to tell you what it was like to grow up in a red line neighborhood and what my experience was. A valuable contribution. A further valuable contribution, if they say, and it really was wounding, and it limited or compromised my opportunities, educational, vocational, and so on and so forth, in a variety of ways. Let me tell you about that. Others who haven't had that experience may not be in a position, let's assume they're not, to make a contribution of a similar kind to the class discussion. But then the question for the class as a whole is, for all the students in the class and for the teacher, the African-American student and all of the others, what do we make of this? How did this actually work? What were its effects? What are the remedies? What explains the fact that years after redlining has ceased to be a legally allowable strategy for real estate agents and city councils and others to pursue? What explains the fact that years after that has ceased to be allowable as a matter of law, we still have a considerable degree of self-segregation in the inner cities of our major metropolitan areas across the country? Those are challenging questions that call for a common effort on the part of those involved to dig down and try to figure out what the truth of the matter is. If one of the students says, black or white, well, I'll tell you what the truth is. It's what I experienced it as being, and you must take my word for it, because I was on the giving or the receiving end of this particular. Then I say, as the teacher, wait a minute. Your experience is a useful addition to the facts under discussion, but it doesn't give you the privilege of claiming the truth for yourself just because you happen to occupy the position you do.
Right. So maybe as a professor, you'd want to argue Rawlsian position of ignorance or Thomas Nagel's view from nowhere, and ask, is there a universal principle behind the redlining where if you didn't know what race you were going to be, is redlining a good rule to imply or not? Therefore, it doesn't really matter who's sitting at the table. We can agree or disagree on which of these deeper moral principles from the great philosophers of ethics in the past have had to say about those sorts of things.
And Nagel's view from nowhere and Rawls's idea of the veil of ignorance in the original position are just devices for giving operational force, you might say, to this notion of independence and neutrality, of the truth as it really and truly is, apart from my own personal perspectival view of things. Those are newfangled ways of describing a very old idea, which goes back to the philosopher from whom our whole tradition of inquiry starts, and that's Socrates, who said to everyone he talked to, well, I know you feel that way. I know that's your experience, but can you justify it?
Right.
Can you explain yourself to me?
So the point you make in your book that I agree with is that if somebody says, you can't understand what it's like to be an African-American man, you're a middle-aged white guy, it stifles conversation. In fact, it's a way of ending the conversation. My truth is mine, and you can't experience it because you're not me.
Sure. And that's a way of redistributing power
Yeah.
and authority in the classroom.
Yeah.
It's a redistributive move. It's a political move. It's not one that is motivated by or even compatible with the search for the truth, as Nagel or Rawls or Socrates.
I just learned about this, the classroom stack, I think it's called. I never heard of this a few months ago, where teachers call on the person that has the most oppressive categories, and they're the ones that get to speak first. And then, so basically the white guys speak last.
Yeah. It's true. But, Michael, if we take the broadest view of this, the idea behind that practice, which I find extremely distasteful and incompatible with my view of what college and university life ought to be like. If we take a very long historical view, that idea goes all the way back to the prophets of Israel, who said to the powers that be, to the privileged and comfortable, you don't see what's really going on here. I do, because I see things from the margin. I'm an outsider. Isaiah is our first, and Jeremiah, these are our first prototypical outsiders. And they proclaim the truth from the privileged position of their outsider status, as one might say, today. And that is an ethical principle that the further removed you are from the centers of power and comfort and well-being, the more clearly you can see what's really going on. That ethical idea is deeply embedded in our whole moral and philosophical tradition.
Right. As a point of detail, Bakke, in the Bakke case, Bakke was a white guy who did not get admitted into medical school, right?
Yeah. The way the program in Bakke worked was as follows. The medical school at Davis had 100 or so spots in its incoming class each year in the medical school. And they had an open competition for 90 of those spots. 10 they set aside and declared open only to minority applicants. So white applicants couldn't even apply for those 10 spots. Bakke applied to the medical school. He was not admitted under the general admissions program, and he was ineligible to apply for these 10. And he said, I might have had a very good shot at one of those 10 spots, but the opportunity to compete for them was taken away by the set-aside program, and that's unconstitutional because you can't use race to define a special category of admits.
You have a sense of how the Harvard lawsuit's going to turn out?
Oh boy, I hate to speculate about these things. I mean, I read the briefs. I think the facts are awkward for Harvard. That's my sense of it. The Harvard admissions program, as I understand it, had several different categories or dimensions along which it evaluated applicants to the college. The first two, I think, were test scores and academic performance, and the second was maybe letters of recommendation, the core academic performance markers. Or maybe those were the first three. But then there was a kind of a squishy category, I forget what it was called, something like personality or whatever. It was kind of a grab bag. And statistically, Asian American applicants who did very well on all of the academic dimensions were systematically marked down on their personality scores.
Right.
And African American applicants who did less well on the academic side were marked up in the personality category. So that last category was used as a way of leveling up, truing up, so to speak, to get to the right ethnic mix that the college was aiming at and managed year after year after year to achieve within a couple of percentage points one way or the other. So that's awkward. I mean, Harvard has something to say, I think, at least in defense of its practice. I'm surprised that the judge hasn't ruled yet.
Yeah.
My guess is we'll probably hear from her pretty soon. But I think there's a reasonably good chance that Harvard will lose in the federal district court. And then, of course, it will go to the Court of Appeals. And from there, perhaps, if the Supreme Court decides to take it, up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, on this issue of discrimination, and these are private institutions, Harvard, Yale, say. I went to Pepperdine University in Malibu. It was Church of Christ school. Mm-hmm. I was a Christian when I went there, and it would be fun to teach there. It's a beautiful campus overlooking the Pacific Ocean.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful. But, I'm a pretty outspoken public atheist now, and, I would not feel discriminated against if they said, Shermer, we're never going to hire you. I mean, our mission is a Christian college, and you're an outspoken atheist. You just don't fit the mission. Yeah. And I don't see that would be discrimination, but that's probably different than, say, race. Beliefs versus race.
Yes. Well, first of all, with respect to Pepperdine, I think you'd be an excellent faculty appointment precisely because
of that, yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised if they welcomed you on that account.
They might.
I've been to the campus several times. I spoke at a graduation there
a
few years back. And it's a Christian campus. There's no doubt about that. But I made my own pagan-ish views publicly known when I was there, and had wonderful exchanges with my
you're a born-again pagan. I love that in your bio.
That's right. That's me. That's how I describe myself.
But the point, I think, in discrimination law, we distinguish between something that you are by nature, gay or straight, say, versus a belief. So if in the analogy with the cake baker, if a Jewish baker is approached by a couple of neo-Nazis that want him to make a wedding cake with a swastika, he's justified in saying, I'm not going to do it.
Sure.
Because that's just a belief versus a gay couple, because they don't choose to be. You choose to believe in Nazis or not. You don't choose to be gay or not.
Yes.
Something like that.
Yes, exactly. And a denominational college or university whose mission includes the furtherance of the teachings and practices of a particular religious tradition are, I think, with perfectly within their rights in picking and choosing among candidates for faculty positions on the basis, in part, of their religious beliefs. Though I know at Brigham Young, I've spoken with faculty friends who teach at BYU, and I'm told that it's not a condition of appointment to the faculty that you be a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints. But you need to, I'm not quite sure how it's put, you need to affirm in your lifestyle commitments, whatever that may mean, that you're broadly with the program. So there's something like a cultural test, which the university applies in deciding whether to accept whether to take somebody as a candidate for a faculty position or not.
Yeah. Let's talk about speech codes, microaggressions, trigger warnings, and all that kind of stuff now.
Yeah.
When I was in college, I remember when the he/she thing started, and we have to be cautious not to use over masculinized language, and all that. And I thought, well, okay, it's kind of trivial, but I guess it's not a big deal. And when you kind of look at the bigger picture, Richard Dawkins makes this point. He's deeply read in literature, and he says he can pinpoint about down to the decade when a novel was written, based on how the novelist talks about Jews and blacks and women and so on, just the language. And then he has excerpts, and they are almost painful to read.
Yes, sure.
From our perspective today. So I can definitely see, that's a good thing that we, moderate our speech, because how you talk about people affects how you think about people.
Sure.
But at some point, it seems like it tipped over into something just insane. Preferred pronouns, and you can't use this word or that word, and you just tiptoeing around campus. I ask my students every semester, how many of you self-censor in class? Every hand goes up. They, they're always super cautious. So the question is, how much is good, but how much is too much?
Sure, of course. Well, all those points are valid ones. You pick up, one of Mark Twain's novels, or F. Scott Fitzgerald's, or William Faulkner's, And there are passages where a reader today cringes.
Yeah.
But of course, you can't imagine the novels with those passages excised,
Right.
or blacked out. Just it wouldn't be the same. And some degree, maybe a considerable degree of charity, caution, generosity, deference in speech is a valuable, maybe even an essential lubricant to conversation. But beyond a certain point, an insistence with a politburo rigor on the use of particular words to describe particular people in particular situations begins to feel pretty oppressive to me. But this is the main thing I want to say about speech, about campus speech. The debate over free speech on campus tends to devolve into a debate between the partisans of two conflicting points of view. And I think both of them have it wrong. One perhaps a little wronger than the other, but both of them have it wrong. On the one side are those who favor restrictions on campus speech for the sake, they say, of avoiding dignitary harms to those who will be offended or wounded, hurt by speech of one kind or another. Speaker comes on campus and defends the proposition that women should stay at home and take care of the kids and not to work outside of the household, and that is not just thought by many on campus to be Neanderthalish and reprehensible, but it's a wound, it's an insult, and it's like a fist in the face. It is as direct and painful as a punch, and so the person with that view should not be allowed to come and express it any more than you would allow someone to come on campus and start spraying mace around in people's faces. You just wouldn't allow it. Right. We have a community here. We need to protect ourselves, our vulnerable members. That person stays off campus. That's one camp. On the other side are the speech libertarians who say, let 1,000 flowers bloom. The freer the speech, the better. Speech is the engine of truth. We should let conflicts multiply and bubble up and be as fierce as they become, and so on and so forth. A campus is just like Speaker's Corner down the street in your neighborhood park, where people get up and they declaim and they say the most outrageous things. And right. If we allow it there, well, we should allow it on campus too. And I think they both get it wrong.
Yeah.
The first group, because a college or university is there not, as Jonathan Haidt might say, to coddle and protect its students, to insulate them against difficult or wounding experience. It's there for the sake of teaching and learning and for the pursuit of the truth. And if there are some bruises along the way, well, it kind of comes with the territory. And students shouldn't be deliberately insulated against that by keeping threatening and dangerous speakers off campus through a policy of suppression. On the other hand, and this is I think the point that many people miss, speech on campus is not like speech at Speaker's Corner in the park down the street. The people who are gathered around the speaker in the park aren't there to have a conversation. They're listening. They're free to walk away when they want. The speakers themselves aren't having a conversation amongst themselves. One says one thing, the next one can go off on a completely unrelated tangent. They have no obligation to talk to one another and try to make something common and shared out of their inquiry. But that's exactly what the students and faculty on a campus are meant to do. That's what they're there to do. That's what the school is for. It's for the sake of a conversation. And in order to sustain a conversation, people can't derail it by pleading wounded feelings or falling back on the privilege of seeing things from the special point of view of the wounded or disadvantaged or oppressed or whatever. Those are conversation killers. That can't be allowed.
Yeah.
But by the same token, it's not permitted to simply say, that's my view and take it or leave it, and turn your back on what others are saying. You've got to sit and listen and engage. You've got to give an accounting of your own view. You have to listen to what others say. You have to take their criticism seriously and respond as best you can. So against the coddlers and the fragile and those who would limit speech, I say it offends the conversational ideal. And against those who defend the libertarian view, I say you're not talking about a conversation at all.
Right.
You have a very different situation in mind.
Where would you put, just to put names on some examples, Milo Yiannopoulos, Richard Spencer, Jared Taylor, last two white supremacists?
Yeah.
Milo, I'm not sure he actually believes half the stuff he says. He's kind of a professional provocateur.
He is. Yeah,
but I'm not sure I would invite any of them to a college campus along the lines of what you just said. I mean, to what extent are they there to stimulate conversation about a central idea, like along the lines of what you previously said?
Yeah.
Women should. I know conservatives who think this. Women should be home raising the kids, because if they're not, the kids are in trouble, or there's a division of labor and so on, and it's better for society if they are. I could see someone like a Ben Shapiro, who's very smart. He's a good guy. He holds conservative positions that I definitely disagree with. But I could see him being different from, say, Jared Taylor or Milo Yiannopoulos. Where does a college draw the line, of who you invite?
Well, if I were the president or the head of the student society of X, Y, or Z, I would never invite a white supremacist to campus to speak. I would never issue the invitation.
Right.
But if the invitation is issued by some group on campus, or rather, perhaps because they want to poke the bear, because because they're interested in causing a ruckus and stirring the pot, then the question is, the invitation having been issued, what are you going to do? And of course, with the exception of Ben Shapiro, who I think is a very different cup of tea, many of these other speakers do not come to campus for the sake of having a conversation. A conversation is not what they have in mind.
Right.
But that's true of lots of people who are invited to campus to speak. Who is responsible for having the conversation and sustaining it? It's those who are on campus. It's the faculty and students and the administrators who have the responsibility to uphold the conversational ideal in the presence of people for whom the conversational ideal means very little. And of course, they test that ideal. They test it, vigorously, painfully.
Yeah.
And those can be awful moments. But in my book, toward the end of the chapter on speech, I imagine Milo Yiannopoulos coming to campus, being invited to come.
I love that passage.
And being met by a student, at the gate, who makes an imaginary speech to him and says, "Look, I know why you're here to cause a stir. You want to get us to fall back on our feelings rather than to think and talk and argue among ourselves. And you won't be able, we're not going to let you do that.
Right.
You can have your say, but you've come to a place which is so deeply committed to the search for truth that you can't derail us." And I say in the book, what a noble speech that would be. And maybe it's too noble by half. It's hard to imagine, but that's the ideal. And Michael, without our ideals, we're lost.
Yeah.
We have to first decide what we want to do, what we think is right and proper and noble, and then do the very best job we can of steering the ship in that direction.
Yeah, most of the public talks I give at universities are invitations by student activities groups, which don't seem all that political, although mostly my talks are not political anyway. But when I see Ben at these Young American Foundation supported talks that they live stream, they're very entertaining to watch. He's a great speaker. But not just that, it's the background to it. These are always sponsored by the Young Republicans group or the College Republicans group. It's
Yeah.
and the build up to it, it's like snowflakes, run for your dorms. Ben
Yeah,
Shapiro's
yeah.
coming. The conservatives are coming. Oh,
Yeah.
the snowflakes are going to be melting. I mean, they
Yeah.
are definitely poking the hornet's nest.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. And I wish the hornet's nest weren't buzzing in as lively a way as it is, and I wish people wouldn't poke it.
Yeah.
I wish that everybody on all sides would tone it down a bit. Wouldn't it be wonderful if Ben Shapiro were co-sponsored by the Young Republicans and the Young Democrats,
Right.
and if
right.
he agreed to have an equally articulate and clever and funny interlocutor who
Right.
could challenge some of his points, give a short talk afterwards, have a back and forth. Wonderful. This is the life of them. This is the open, reckless, vibrant life of the mind, which I love and want my students to have a taste of during the time they're on campus.
Yeah, I tell my students, most of them are pro-choice. Could you articulate the pro-life position?
Yeah.
Beyond just, well, they hate women. No. That's not a pro-life argument.
Yeah.
Watch Ben Shapiro's videos. See if you could steel man his arguments such that he would say, yes, that's exactly what I'm arguing. Most can't do it. I mean, most of us can't steel man the other side's argument. It's hard to do. That seems to be would be a useful activity on campus for someone like a Ben Shapiro to come, which gets me to, so we've done excellence, speech, diversity we've touched on a little bit. Here, your focus is on diversity of opinion or viewpoint diversity, as it's called. To what extent would you encourage departments to hire conservative faculty? Should they even be asking that question? Who did you vote for in the last election?
I'm inclined, Michael, to say no, that politics shouldn't come into it. To the extent it does, you're focusing on the wrong thing. You should be looking at the candidate's work, scholarship, their achievements and gifts as a teacher. All of those things obviously matter in a direct and visible way to their appointment to the faculty. Of course, some of my colleagues say, well, there is no separating politics from scholarship at the end of the day. These things, one runs into the other, and they're very hard to pry apart. Let me put it this way. I try not to believe that. I try as hard as I possibly can not to believe that. And of course, I recognize, you'd be a fool not to, that a person's worldview, including their deep value judgments about politics and morality and social life in general, enter into everything they do. And if they're an academic, into the articles and books they write, at least if they're in the humanities. If they're a chemist, as you were saying before,
right.
Or an economist even, maybe a little less directly. But even so, I try, and I think appointments committees ought to try to put the political side of it out of view and focus on the magnitude of the intellectual achievement. Is it original? Is it well argued? Whether you believe it or not, is the logic sound, and are the facts well mustered to support the claim? Those are the kinds of things that matter, and I think ought to matter pretty exclusively.
Yeah. You're familiar with all these surveys over the past 20 years or so showing the percentage of professors' political orientation, particularly in the social sciences and humanities, 80-20, 90-10, 95-5. You're lucky if you find one professor who identifies as a conservative in humanities departments, with the exception of economics and social sciences. It's pretty slanted. And yet, if you show a slide of, the percentage of Americans and how they vote, it's 49-51. It's, pretty close to 50-50.
Right.
The argument could be made, well, students are not really going to get a balanced view in social science and humanities types courses. Is that true? And if so, what's the correction for that, given that we can't hire people based on their, political attitudes? You can't even ask, I suppose.
Here's one thought off the top of my head. I teach in a freshman program at Yale called Directed Studies. It's a very old-fashioned program. It's been around for 70 years. It was started right after the Second World War with the aim of introducing returning veterans to the main texts of the Western civilization that they had just fought to save.
Mm-hmm.
And it has survived. It's of course, it's undergone some pretty significant changes over the years, but the core of it has remained more or less the same. In the fall, the students begin with Homer and Plato and Herodotus, and they march on through until by the end of the spring term they've reached Hannah Arendt and Virginia Woolf and others. It's a very intensive program of an old-fashioned kind. It's not, how can I put this? Programs like this once existed in abundance on American campuses across the country. Not many of them remain. There are some,
right.
And some very much like Directed Studies. Programs of this kind tend to attract faculty who have a more traditional conception of the humanities and how these disciplines should be approached and taught. And if programs of this kind were given a little bit more visibility and support, I think they would attract faculty certainly of a more traditional, maybe of a more conservative bent, although in Directed Studies, the politics of the faculty who teach in it are all over the map. And I suspect most of them are pretty liberal to progressive, just as they are in every other program. But putting the politics of it to one side, why not support old-fashioned programs of this kind on a wider scale, on more campuses, and in that way introduce a bit of old-fashioned traditionalism back into a curriculum that has become so faddish and cutting edge that much of the greatness of the past has, been temporarily or permanently mothballed, and it just isn't taught anymore. Just to say that's a conservative proposal. Putting the politics of it aside, to say that is viewed as a strikingly conservative point of view. To me, it's just humanities education as I've experienced it and always understood it.
Yeah, again, I think that gets back to this search for universal truths that anyone can understand, doesn't matter what your race or gender is, versus literature that shares the experience of what it's like to be somebody in one of these positions.
Yes.
Both are valuable, but your point, I have to agree with. There has to be a role in the academy for the search for truth, universal truths. Even if we don't agree on what the exact right one is, at least there's a debate about these are what the top 10 greatest thinkers of all time said about this particular issue. We should know that.
Well, I feel that way very strongly. But take Homer's Iliad, for example. That's about as remote from the experience of a 21st century American as one can get, with the exception perhaps of some who have actually experienced battle firsthand, who know what war is like. But for 17 and 18-year-olds, fresh to college, new to college, who are reading the book for the first time, asking them to put themselves in Hector's shoes or Achilles and to try to figure out what the world looks like from that point of view, that is a huge stretch for them. In many ways, at least as difficult, if not more so, than asking them to put themselves in the position of a member of a disadvantaged or oppressed racial or ethnic group in contemporary America. At least there they've got something to go on. But this is really a big stretch. And so in many ways, I think reading these old books and trying to get into them, into the inside of them, and onto the wavelength of the characters and the author is a tremendously challenging exercise in imagination. And then, having done that, to pull back a little bit and say, well, are there any lasting truths that Homer has to teach us in his story about Achilles and his anger? It's hard enough to get inside that anger and feel it yourself, but having taken a step in that direction, to then take a big step back and say, what does glory mean? And is glory of value? Glory is the central value of the poem, but is that something we should ever celebrate? Or is it just death and destruction wherever you look? Maybe we should bury glory under a rock and be done with it. Can human beings do without glory, though? Aren't we glory-loving beings? Is it? And so on and so forth. That's the kind of conversation I love to have with my kids, and it's a conversation in pursuit of the truth.
See, this is one of the appeals, I think, of Jordan Peterson of late, is this idea that there are universal truths found in literature and myths.
Yes.
And so he and I have been having these, he's a good friend, and I really like Jordan, but we disagree on certain fundamental issues, like, is there a God? You ask me and I say, no, I'm an atheist. If you ask Jordan, do you believe in God? He says, well, I need 40 hours to answer that. Oh, okay. Okay. Well, what do you mean by God? Or if I ask him, do you think Jesus was, resurrected, from the dead? Was he risen from the dead? He probably existed, probably was crucified. The Romans crucified everybody, but it's a separate, truth question. Was he resurrected? But Jordan goes off onto this whole thing about we all must bear our own burden of the cross because life is hard. And so it's like, yes. Okay. That's a kind of a truth. I get that. But this other question, was he really risen from the dead? No, I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about the meaning of it, So that's that difference between mythic truths and maybe scientific or empirical truths.
Yeah. Well, this is actually something I'm thinking a lot about right now because I'm hoping to write a much shorter book than my next to last one, which was called Confessions of a Born-Again Pagan.
Oh, yeah.
And it ran on to 1,100 pages.
Oh, boy.
And people who bought it, actually one of my friends at the law school said, well, when it came out, I bought 2 copies, one to read and the other to use when I'm parking on steep hills.
Right. Pop it behind the tire.
I'm hoping now to write a shorter book on the same subject. And here's a question that I've been very much preoccupied with. Many mythical structures, systems, and many philosophical systems, I would say nearly all of the main ones in the whole tradition of Western philosophical thought have been concerned with the question of how to understand the relationship between time and eternity. What lasts for a time and then vanishes, and what never comes into being or goes out of being, but in the words of the gospel, endures from age to age, between time and eternity. I say, if you believe that that's an important question, you're a religious person, regardless of what you understand eternity to be.
Right.
You could be a Platonist. You could be an Aristotelian. You could be a follower of Augustine or Luther or Maimonides or any of the great Islamic Al-Ghazali or Avicenna. They all believed in eternity in one way or another and thought that human life was empty and meaningless unless it could somehow be connected to what Aristotle calls the eternal and divine. So the question is, I'm coming back around to what you said just a minute ago, the fundamental question is, does the meaning of life of human life, depend upon its connection to something which lasts not just longer than the life itself, but lasts forever and ever and ever and ever, which is eternal in its duration? Or is the meaning of life, whatever you make of it, in the time between birth and death, and that's it, and eternity is just a figment of our imagination and a word that signifies nothing, and we're better off without it? If you think that's the truth of the matter, then you are not a religious person. If you think that it does matter, then you are a religious person, and the truth question is, who's got the better of that argument? I think the religious ones have the better of the argument when it comes to its pure truthfulness. And in my next book, I'm going to prove that.
So that's what you mean by born-again pagan. You're a religious pagan.
I'm a religious, yes. I'm, a lot is now made of this new category, spiritual but not religious. Religious. And I would, of course, many people describe themselves in that way. I might say what I am is a Spinozist.
Yeah, Spinozist. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. Well, for what it's worth, there is research, empirical research on the difference between happiness and meaningfulness. That is, in terms of things you could do that make you happy versus things that you can do to lead a more meaningful life. And they're quite independent and sometimes in contrast or conflict. For example, things that you do that in the short run are fun, like, out to dinner with family and friends or doing some fun activity. But when it's over, it's over. There's no lasting activity to it. Yeah. Whereas the analogy I use is being a caretaker for two of my four parents, step-parents. And this wasn't fun at all. I wasn't happy doing it. But, in the long run, after a decade of doing this for my mom and my dad, I felt like a better person for it.
Yes.
And so like Roy Baumeister did a research project on this, showing that things that are sort of stressful, long-term, have some kind of connection to something outside of yourself.
Yes.
It takes you outside of yourself. It could be like I'm working for a nonprofit, or I'm working toward this goal to, bend the arc of the moral universe, or expand the moral sphere, or work toward ending poverty, or something like that. Yes. It isn't. Most of the activities you do are not fun.
No, agreed. There's happiness with a small h and happiness with a capital H. Happiness with a small h is overrated.
Yeah. And
we do many things that do not make us happy in the small h sense, out of a sense of integrity or responsibility, or just leading a life that has direction and purpose and meaning to it. If we are successful in that endeavor, we leave a lot of fun, behind, for sure. But I think at the end of the day, if we succeed in living as meaningful a life as we can, we come close to the mark of happiness with a capital H, which is for me just a synonym for fulfillment or achievement or being what Aristotle called, it's a beautiful word, a serious human being. We say that was a serious piece of pizza. That's a serious bull terrier. And what you mean is it's a wonderful example of the kind. You say that's a serious person. That's a serious human being. What you mean is they really are doing a good job of being human.
Right.
They're excellent in the work of being human, which brings us back full circle to where we started.
And to your last chapter on memory. I remember when the flap over Calhoun College at Yale happened, and I remember thinking, wait, wasn't LEU Yale himself a slave trader? Yeah, I mean, wouldn't you have to change the name of the company? Well, that's not going to happen.
Well, of course, people distinguished the cases, and they said Mr. Yale only traded slaves. He didn't openly and expressly defend the institution of slavery in the way John Calhoun did. And all of that is true. But, a college or university, it's an institution of memory. It's a place which is consecrated to the preservation of the past and coming to terms with it, no matter how difficult or awkward or painful the past may be. We shouldn't sweep the past under the rug. Right. I mean, I can understand why a monument in a city park to a Confederate general is a thorn in the side of the city's African-American residents, and why a mayor like Mayor Landrieu in New Orleans might have decided that it should come down. But colleges and universities are not political institutions. They have a special responsibility, I think, to confront the past, to come to terms with it. And in the case of Calhoun College, I thought, to put it very simply, there was a great learning opportunity here.
Mhm.
You know, no one today would think of naming a college after John Calhoun or doing anything in his name. But there it is. It was done, almost 90 years ago in the early 1930s for reasons that seemed good and sufficient at the time. They don't now. But if you keep the name, are you honoring John Calhoun, the man? No. You're honoring Yale's own attempt, incompletely and fitfully, to come to terms with its own very difficult past. And that's worth preserving and honoring. So I said, keep the name, you know, raise $50 million quietly on the side to endow a program for the study of antebellum America that will be named after one of Yale's most prominent African-American graduates, Edward Boucher, received his PhD in 1876, first African-American to receive the degree in the United States, and support a world-class program in his name to study the world that John Calhoun helped to make and to unmake. And you can do that without getting rid of the name of Calhoun College, and you'll be making lemonade out of lemons. And isn't that better, really, than changing the name of the college and sweeping things under the rug?
That does seem different than the Confederate statues. I remember reading when they were put up. So the question is, why were they put up? They were not put up in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, say, to honor the dead, but in the early 1900s by people that wanted to champion this kind of white supremacist or Old South when people knew their position and so on. And there I could see, okay, that's a reason to take them down, because they were put up in the first place, not for this other reason to honor the dead, but to represent as a proxy for something else that we no longer accept.
Even there, I think, Michael, I would draw a distinction between monuments on campus and off campus. You're absolutely right that many of these were put up at the height of the Jim Crow era, you know, in the teens and 20s by the Daughters of the Confederacy, you know, survivors of the Ku Klux Klan or active members of the Ku Klux Klan. And that's all, in hindsight, horrible, reprehensible. But at the University of North Carolina, for example, where such a statue was erected to an unnamed representative member of the Confederate Army, it was called Silent Sam, and the statue was torn down in the middle of the night, you know, a year or so ago. On campus, I would say, as painful a reminder of a terrible past as that is, leave the statue in place and surround it with other monuments and references to Jim Crow and its terrible legacy and meaning for the South, and create a program devoted to the study of Jim Crow. Everybody, well, I'm going to go out on a limb here, every student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill should spend a semester studying the history of the South from, Jamestown to Jim Crow, and learn about this and raise the money to support such a program, bring in the best teachers in the world, make a big deal out of it, make the history come alive. Don't think that you can address it adequately by knocking the statue down. That's easy to do.
Yeah.
A program of the kind I've just described is hard.
Yeah. Well, and you make a distinction between all that and, say, the denazification of Germany when they went and took down statues of Hitler and changed the name. I remember one of them was like Joseph Goebbels Strasse. Well, we can't have streets named after these guys. And then after, the Stalin statues were taken down, there was an article a couple of years ago about these statues that are all tucked away in these warehouses are being hauled out again now as he's making a little bit of a revival, which is kind of disturbing.
Yes, it is, for sure. But, Robert E. Lee was not Joseph Goebbels.
Yes.
He is still a revered figure in parts of the country. His name is plastered all over high schools across the the South. There are monuments to him in countless parks and municipal buildings. I was watching at home the other day when I was on my exercise bike an episode in a video series about the Second World War. The tank that the Americans introduced in 1944, I guess it was after the D-Day invasion, the new state-of-the-art tank, which completely eclipsed anything the Germans had, was called the Lee and Sherman tank.
Oh, boy.
Lee and Sherman
Oh, my
tank.
God.
Isn't that amazing?
That
so
is
you've
amazing.
got the united power
Right.
of William Tecumseh Sherman and Robert E. Lee. That's indomitable.
Yeah.
So in 1943, in our crusade against the Nazi monsters, we put Robert E. Lee to work. And so, each of these cases is complex and needs to be evaluated on its own terms. And we shouldn't take the worst imaginable case, the hypothetical statue, to the commandant of Auschwitz, and make that our norm in deciding what to do with all of these others.
We need way more subtlety on that. And the other problem is this idea that, in 2019, we now know perfectly what the correct moral values are for all eternity, and therefore we can judge everybody that came before you. In this black and white category, if you're not perfectly politically correct, then your statue's coming down.
Well, it's yes, I do talk about that in the book. Everybody likes to pat themselves on the back, but pride is a fault, if not a sin. And it's such a tempting one. It's so easy to fall into the habit of believing that you live in the first generation of truly enlightened human beings, and before you there was nothing but obscurity and ignorance and moral wickedness, and that thank goodness the sun rose and we've seen things in their true light. Have we made advances in this country? Tremendous advances. Have we made advances in my lifetime? Tremendous advances. I can remember as a boy when Brown against Board of Education was decided, and my parents danced around the dining room table. This was an amazing moral event in the Kronman household when I was growing up in Southern California in the early 1950s. And it's always been that to me. And that was a step in the right direction. We've taken further steps. Do we have further steps to go? You bet we do. You bet we do.
I can see people 100 years from now looking back on those people in the early 21st century. They ate meat. They killed 1 trillion sentient beings a year. It was like Auschwitz every year.
I know. Yeah. One of my colleagues said that, we will be the few people who today say that eating meat is a crime against humanity will be viewed in 100 years as the abolitionists of our age.
Right. Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah,
so,
that's right. Yeah.
So a little bit of humility isn't bad here, and keeping reminders of a painful past around is a spur to humility.
So you're a humanist, and you end your epilogue talking about being a humanist. I'm a humanist. And you write, the dual loyalties of American humanists like me are therefore not as contradictory as they seem. This is how you end your book. The real danger of the present hour is not the tension between them. It is the drive to eliminate the tension by making these loyalties one and the same, by democratizing the inner life of our colleges and universities. So the rule of equality that prevails outside them comes to be the norm in the now masterless world of teaching and learning as well.
Yes,
what a grievous loss that would be for our students, their schools, the country at large. Enough is enough. It's time to rally around the ivory tower.
I'll stand by that.
Absolutely. I have to say, it's a tribute to your writing. I could not tell if you were conservative, liberal, whatever. At first glance, I thought, boy, this is like an old white guy conservative, say, we got to get back to the good old days. On the other hand, you talk about, protesting the Vietnam War. I was like, oh, he used to be a hippie.
Yeah. Well, I'm, politically pretty liberal. I'm not Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez liberal. I'm probably not Elizabeth Warren liberal, though I admire many of her ideas and her intellectual clarity and verve. This is irrelevant, I suppose, but I'll tell you anyway. I've been a lifelong member of the Democratic Party. I've supported Democratic candidates and Democratic causes. That's my politics. But when it comes to the academy and its values and norms, I guess I would describe myself as a conservative. I'm an academic conservative and a political liberal. And I see no tension, certainly not a contradiction between those two things. And I don't believe that there is any requirement. Indeed, I firmly resist anyone who suggests that we ought to require that these things be all of a piece.
Yeah.
And those who want to democratize the academy want to remake it in the image of the egalitarian values that have their proper place in our political life, but do not have the same proper place in our colleges and universities.
Perfect.
Different places, different norms.
Perfectly said, Anthony. The Assault on American Excellence. It's a great read. I really enjoyed it, and congratulations on the new book. I wish you best on the next book. Hope the book does good. We will release it the day it comes out on the podcast here. So I hope it's widely read and has the effect that it hopes to have. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.